All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Elise Zipkin. I've known Elise for 20 years. We first met as first-year graduate students at Cornell University. After that, Elise worked for both USGS while pursuing her PhD at Maryland. And then after that, she continued to work for USGS before joining the faculty at Michigan State University, where she is now a full professor and director of their Ecology and Evolutionary Biology program. And it's just really great to have her here. And I'm excited to hear about her talking about butterflies, not squirrels, which she kept trying to tell me it was about squirrels, so I was foolish. All right, thank you, Elise.
So he said, he said, what are you talking about today? I was like, squirrels. So you know what I mean? Yeah, thank you. I'm very, very happy to be here. And I would like to say a huge thank you to Willie Fetzer and Sarah Collins for inviting me, but more accurately, allowing them to invite myself, actually, because when I heard about the opportunity, I was like, I really want to come out here and come to the Grand Tetons and give a talk here. So today I'm going to talk about butterfly declines, which is something that we've been working on in my lab for quite some time. And we're going to go deeply into monarchs as we think about the full kind of insect apocalypse, is a term that's been used in the press to describe what's been going on with insects. Okay, so probably a lot of you are aware that species around the world are really very threatened. And the more assessments that are done, so this is a graph from the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they assess species through time. So let's see if I can do this. Yeah, okay. And basically, as we're assessing more and more species, we continue to find more and more threatened species. So now we're at about 50,000 threatened species worldwide, and this is actually all just vertebrates. So the kinds of extinction rates that we're seeing and threatened that we're seeing of species is really hundreds of times higher than what we've seen in the geological records. So some evidence that maybe we're entering the sixth mass extinction event. So a key challenge in ecological research, modern ecological research and conservation, is to figure out why is biodiversity declining and what specifically we can do for each kind of individual things that we're looking at. But protecting biodiversity is really, really challenging. You know, it's conceptually simple, but it's really actually very hard to do. And that's for a variety of different reasons. We have many factors that influence species dynamics and abundance. You know, environments are changing at very rapid rates. And another thing, for a lot of different species, they're not just occurring in one location. They might be using really expansive habitat. So it's not like we could, you know, draw an area around their habitat and protect them except for, you know, a small number of endemic species. So this is an example here with the cerulean warbler, which is a species that has been deemed threatened. And what you can see is that it's got this really wide migratory range, like all across, you know, the east and west during the summer, and then wintering in the northern part of South America. So really thinking about where do they use, which habitat's important to them, how do we protect them, is a very, very complicated process. So my lab focuses on trying to understand and predict how and why nature is changing, what are the consequences of those changes, and what can we do about it. And I like to think of us, what we do is we try to solve conservation problems. And really, we come from it kind of from a mathy, statsy side, and we take on those kinds of problems that are really unwieldy, you know, that are not straightforward, not using experimental data, but using whatever we can to answer those kinds of questions. And we focus on all different things. So I'm going to talk about butterflies today, but we do research on many different kinds of species. So we're agnostic on what kinds of species we're interested in. So you've probably seen, right, we were talking about this, that there's a lot of research that's been done about species declining, but the vast majority of that is on vertebrate species. So there's a lot less that's been done on things like insects, but insects are really, really important. Okay, so first of all, I just looked this up, and now I'm going to forget it. But the biomass, if you weighed all the biomass of all the insects in the world, it would be more than all the biomass, the weight of all people and livestock combined. There's 1 million known species of insects, and the estimate is there's somewhere between 2 million to 40 million species, just species. So we're talking about, huge numbers of insects that provide all sorts of services, right? So they do a lot of things to keep our ecosystems healthy. They're important for decomposition, sorry, and pollination. They eat plants that are important for herbivory, so nutrient cycling. And then also, actually, most insect species, they're prey for other species. So lots of other higher level species in that food web eat them at different stages. Even ones you think of, oh, maybe butterflies, they're not eaten as adults. Well, there's a lot that are eaten as caterpillars. So they're really, really important, but really understudied. So the kinds of stuff that we've been seeing, however, is that whenever there is kind of new research that's coming out on available insect data, we tend to find, yes, we're seeing declines, they're widespread. And the reasons for this are also pretty unknown. So this is from a paper that came out in the Proceedings of National Academies a few years, and it was just saying, there's a bunch of different things that are hurting insects in all different areas, and trying to figure out what's the most important, what's really the cause is really hard, So is it death by 1,000 cuts? Is it something more important over here and something different over there? Is it this insect is responding to that thing and something else in another location, another species? So this kind of insect apocalypse is really posing lots of new challenges for understanding why species are declining, understanding for how to deal with multiple different species, not just focusing, I'm sure all of you are aware of the famous, wolves and Yellowstone kind of research, and that's where you're thinking about one system or a few species together. And so this kind of thing of what do we think about even common species declining, and how do we deal with this? So it's just kind of this new thing that's really coming on the horizon last decade or so. So as part of that, the USGS funded a working group. And this is a project that I was part of where a bunch of different scientists that work on butterflies came together. And our goal was to aggregate all the basic data across the continental US to do a status of butterflies in the United States to figure out, okay, what's going on? Do we know? The reason we picked butterflies is a couple things. First, people love butterflies. And the reason that people love butterflies, right, is they're gorgeous. They're kind of they're important culturally for a lot of different groups. And because of that, there's a lot of volunteer collected data that we can really rely on, where people go out and collect run different transects or count the number of butterflies they see in a way that no scientists or groups of scientists could do. And it's hard to kind of overstate the value of those data. Like, for example, and we'll get into this, in the Midwest, there are people who go out every single week and walk the same line transect for 30 years at the same locations. So that kind of like longitudinal data that we have from volunteers, right, is just fantastic, right? So that's available for butterflies, and it's just not available for other types of species. So our goal was to aggregate all those kinds of surveys, all those citizen science surveys, all the researcher collected surveys that were collected across different species on a large scale. And so over a course of about 2 years, we aggregated data from 35 monitoring programs and 76,000 surveys that had collected data on 12.6 million butterflies. And that was from 554 species that were observed. And I'll just let you know that there are about 650 species in the continental US. So even in this approach, right, we're not seeing everything, but that's still a pretty high number, including a bunch of rare species. And we divided the continental US up into these different groups, and that was for a couple reasons. One, these groups are regions that were decided by US Fish and Wildlife Service, where they're kind of these large-scale ecosystems, so they're similar to some extent, and they're managed kind of on that broad scale. And so our goal was to understand how are butterflies doing? How are the individual species doing? How are they doing across these different regions? And are there any that are doing well? and what are doing poorly. And this was, I really kind of want to underscore that it was a lot of work to do, because we have to think about how to account for all these differences in the 35 different monitoring programs. And so we're not just modeling where people walked or what this program did it this way and they collected a lot more data, or started a very long time ago and this program is newer. So we really had to sit through and think about, all right, how do we put these data together in a way that's really meaningful? So I wanted this paper, and this paper was published in March 2025. Actually, I was on Science Friday then too. So there's a cool, if you want to know more about it, there's a cool podcast on it. So what did we find? Well, so butterflies are declining across the continental US. So of those 7 geographic regions, 6 had declines in total butterfly abundance, ranging from like 0.2% to 2.3% annually over this time frame from the year 2000 to the year 2020. And overall abundance had declined by 1.3% annually. It's over here. So that's a cumulative decline of 22%, 22% of those 554 butterfly species between 2000 and 2022. So what that means is for every 5 butterfly species that we saw in the year 2000, there's only 4 left now. So that's, you know, it doesn't sound like a lot, 1.3% annually, but it's cumulative and it adds up very quickly, right? So that's a very large decline in a very short amount of time. So there was one region, the Pacific Northwest, where abundance increased, but that was driven largely by this highly eruptive species. So the interesting thing about insects, right? I'm sure you guys all know this from pest stuff you've seen through time, but you know, insects in the right conditions, they can explode in abundance, right? We can see really big changes. And so the California tortoiseshell had one of those kind of huge booms, but we don't expect that to increase through time. And when we take, for that to happen again, so when we take out that California tortoiseshell, that group remained kind of flat. So we didn't see those kind of increases. Yeah, so that was pretty alarming. And then we wanted to really dig into what are going on with the individual species. So first, you know, in science, we always think about how can we say something is statistically significant, right? So that's the idea where we're pretty sure, you know, that it's not related to something, uncertainty about it, but with some, you know, confidence, we can say that. For the species, those are ones kind of that are in this the darker colors, the dark red, and then increasing is the dark blue. And what we found is in these ones that we can be really, really sure about, 13 times more species declined than increased over that time frame, right? So that's a pretty big difference. But, and this is really, really interesting, even with all that data we had, for species that the changes were small, so in this range of around, you know, minus 10% to plus 10% over that time frame, which is actually a pretty big range, you know, but we didn't really have any sort of significance, right? And that really means that even though it's a lot of data, we actually don't have enough data to pick up what I consider smaller changes. We have a hard time picking that up. We can only detect it if the change was really big. And so of these species that we categorize as having an average of greater than a 10% decline or greater than a 10% increase, we found that 72% of individual butterfly species declined or were considered this possibly declining, so had more than a negative 10% change. And only 19 of the species increased was under this kind of rubric. So we can really see, you know, what would be that's kind of distressing, and also that there's so few species that are in that kind of unchanged group, which is also kind of interesting, right? Yeah, so this was some of the big research that took us quite, I mean, it's deceptively simple question, but difficult to answer, and it took us quite a long time to do that. So we started thinking, all right, this is good to know. It's good to know information, but we want to understand why the butterflies are declining so that we can figure out what we need to do to protect them, right? So that's the big thing. And that's, you know, something that we're working on broadly. But what I want to talk about now, getting into this, is monarch butterfly decline. So this is something my lab has been working on for, at this point, I guess like 15 years. And to really dig into it, right? And some of the reasons that we picked this species, why do we want to really think about this, is monarchs, they're ubiquitous across North America. They do this amazing, spectacular migration where they go to the same places in Mexico every year. They're big, they're iconic, and people love them. So what's fantastic about monarch butterflies is there are lots and lots of data about them, for them, more than any other species. So we're able to dig into it in a way that we can't with other species. And probably some of you have seen in the news that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has recognized their declines, talked about potential listing under the Endangered Species Act. The IUCN has also categorized them as possibly declining. So there's a lot of data, there's a lot of possibilities, there's a bunch of hypotheses we're going to go into of why they're declining. And, there's evidence that there may be kind of interacting factors. So they're just a good one to really dig into. So first, let me show you the evidence that monarchs are declining. So monarchs all aggregate, well, I'll show you the life history in a second, but in Mexico, in these high elevation oil mill fir forests in the winter. This is all the population east of the Rocky Mountains. So I'm sure some of you know that the west of the Rocky Mountains populations go into Southern California. However, those populations, they're not genetically extinct or distinct, so they interact between each other. There's definitely mixing. But east of the Rocky Mountains, they all go to Mexico. And what's great about that is they're only in a few different locations on these high elevation forests. And because of that, they're easier to count. Now, we can't count each individual because there'd be a lot, hundreds of millions. But instead, what they do is they walk. This is U.S. Fish and the World Wildlife Fund in Mexico. They walk the perimeter of the colonies and they delineate how big of an area does those monarch colonies inhabit. So this is a graph here showing the amount of forest area occupied by monarch butterflies in all the colonies summed up, those little kind of mountain peaks added together. And what we can see is, just this kind of start decline from the time that they started this until more recently. So very big declines. And that this is really the evidence that people use for showing those declines. And by some estimates, the population maybe have declined by as much as 80 or 90%. It's hard to say for sure. So this is reason that people are worried. Now I want to tell you a little bit about the life history. So I mentioned that the monarchs all aggregate in these high oil mill fir forests, okay? And at the end of winter, so this is like early spring, February or so, they start their first migration up into eastern Texas. And in that area, they produce their first generation of eggs. That generation then moves up into the Midwest and the entire area east of the Rocky Mountains, and they produce another 2 to 3 more generations. So that third or fourth generation at the end of the summer, so we're talking sometime, late August or September, they go what's called reproductive diapause, which means they kind of shut off their reproduction organisms and they make this migration all the way. That last generation makes that migration all the way back down to those same sites in Mexico. So this is a really unique species. I'm not a butterfly expert, I'm more the math person, but one of my colleagues who is, and she says, I can think of no other species in the world that both does the multi-generation migration and it goes back to the same location. So it's kind of this really unique phenomenon to this area. So yeah, so it's complicated. And one of the things here that's important is the dynamics of one stage carry over to another stage. You don't have to worry about the specifics of this graph, but all we're saying is we were looking at how does the abundance of monarchs in Ohio, for example, in the summer relate to the temperature and precipitation in the spring in Texas, in that eastern Texas area. And what we found is there could be really significant effects that how those spring and summer climate conditions were previously sometimes are more important than even what's going on in the summer in that specific location of where you see them. And so if you just try to look at what's going on with monarchs, where you're seeing them, you're probably going to not understand what's going on with this full annual cycle. So, so we knew we had to kind of think about that. So there's been a few hypotheses on why monarchs are declining. And I would say the most common three, right, that are kind of going on that the scientific literature still debates about are the three listed here. So that's the milkweed limitation hypothesis, the migration survival hypothesis, and the climate change hypothesis. And we wanted to figure out which of these might be the reasons that are causing monarch declines. So let's just go through them. What are they? So the milkweed limitation hypothesis, I'm sure you've heard of this one because I feel like this is the most popular. For show of hands, have people heard of it? Yeah, okay. This is the most popular one. So the basic idea, let me show you the evidence for this. So here is a plot, the same plot of that early winter population size. So the size area occupied in Mexico, right? And I put this dash line in here. You'll see why in a bit. So this is 2004. But you see this declining over this time period. At the same time period, what I have is across the Midwest, the county level glyphosate use. So that's, you know, Roundup. Okay, so this is how much this took. This graph, by the way, took us like a couple of years to make. So this is like, you know, I'd go through like all the USGS data to figure this out. So this is how much per county, like the proportion that we think of the crops that are sprayed by Roundup, by glyphosate. And what we can see is that sort of increases to about this year, around 2004, and then it levels off, okay? So this idea between, you know, the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, which is the steepest part of the decline. So people had been, the evidence for this is largely based on this kind of observation that monarchs started declining around the same time that we really increased the amount of Roundup and glyphosate application. So that's kind of why people, you know, started thinking this is the most important reason. Okay, so the next one is what's called the migration survival hypothesis. And that's the idea that disease or reduced nectar availability during that southerly migration, loss of winter foresting habitat, all those things kind of combined are the reason that the monarchs are declining. And let me show you the evidence that people thought about this. So this graph here is this graph of this expected count of monarchs at what we call NAVA sites. Has anybody heard of NAVA? It's the North American Butterfly Association. Okay, so they go around this data. This is arguably the best you know, citizen science butterfly data that exists. Starting from the mid-70s, you know, this group of people, they go out and they collect these kind of July 4th butterfly counts where big groups of people go together and collect that. And if you take this counts of monarchs as best as you can that are during this time, that's the peak abundance, so the end of the summer, right before that last generation migrates down, and you plot that, what people found is that looked, the monarch colonies at the end of the summer, they are the size of the monarch population at the end of the summer didn't appear to be declining. So people said, okay, how, if it's the glyphosate, if it's the, you know, milkweed limitation that kills all the milkweed, why wouldn't we see that decline in the summer population? So that's where people started thinking about that. And then some other work done by us and other people showed actually we can find a significant relationship of the amount of greenness in the autumn landscape. So that's like a proxy for how much nectar is available during that southerly migration down, how that relates to the size of the overwintered colony. So there's evidence, you know, for this hypothesis as well. Maybe this is a driver, right, of what's going on. And then the last one is the climate change hypothesis. And, you know, this is a little bit more complicated. And the idea is basically that direct and indirect effects of climate change, you know, lead to reduced fecundity. So the number of eggs that are laid on milkweed and reduced survival. And that is what's causing the monarch decline. So there's a couple different evidence for this, right? So some would be like, so milkweed, you know, all the monarchs, they're milkweed obligants. They have to lay their eggs on milkweed, and that's what their the caterpillar stages, the different instar stages eat. So milkweed, if it's too dry, it's too hot, that milkweed won't last, especially in the end of summer during certain times when the butterflies, the caterpillars really need them. And then the other thing is there's been done this laboratory experiments that show how much of the population survives under different kind of thermal temperatures, right? So monarchs need this very specific amount of energy, which we measure by growing degree days. So like if the temperature is between a certain amount each day, they need a cumulative amount to get through all their stages to become an adult. And if they don't have that exactly right, or it's too hot at some of the times, they can be killed or not be able to successfully reach adulthood. So there's all these different hypotheses, and there's evidence for all of them, right? It's not that these are coming out of nowhere. People have been doing a lot of research to find, okay, we know that these are all important. But the question that we sort of wanted to ask was, what is the relative contribution of each of these stressors along the migratory route to monarch declines, which we know they're important. Relative, can we put this together, right? To know that. So what we did is we developed a full annual cycle of the model. And one thing I really want to mention here, remember that dashed line that I showed you of 2004 and afterwards? Given the data availability, we had to start our analysis in 2004. There really wasn't time or data available to go back further in time. So that's important to note because that's after the time period of that really big increase of the Roundup. So we're saying, all right, from the last 20 years, 15, 20 years from now, what are causing the declines? We can't really easily say, there actually just isn't data available to say, okay, prior to the early 2000s, why the decline. So I do want you to put in that caveat. And then this is work that was done by my former postdoc, Erin Zylstra, where she put this all together. So I kind of alluded to this when we were talking about all the butterflies, but the thing about the monarch data is they're incomplete, they're patchy, they're available from multiple different sources that are not any kind of random sampling, and they're of variable quality, because they're maybe done in different ways. There's just, opportunistic observations, somebody's going down on our naturalists and says, oh, I saw a monarch, versus the kinds of data where people are walking transects, going to the same places, through time. So what we needed to do was develop this approach where we do what's called data integration, okay? And because I'm a quantitative ecologist, I'm gonna make you learn a little bit about it. I know it was a talk on butterflies, but I always have to throw in a little bit about the math that we do. So what is data integration? And basically, it's just a thing that has a lot of different names. Like if you've ever heard this in literature, or you may even see it like in the newspaper, like integrated models, data simulation. There's a lot of different names for it, but the basic idea is integrating all the available data into a single model that accounts for any kinds of biases or variation in the sampling process of each of the different data types into a single model so that we can understand the biological process. So what we do is we include different kinds of data that we might have available. In this case, it was mostly counts or occurrences of species. We develop what's called like a biological process model. So in this case, we're saying, all right, what is the relationship between monarchs and growing degree days here in these locations? How much do we think, the spring carries over from the other things? So we developed this model that we think is really focused on the biology. And then we develop what's called an observation model. So we link this biological model to the data by accounting for all the kind of errors that are in the different data sources, right? So we're not just modeling that data process like we were talking about before. I don't want to just model because people happen to sample more in the Chicago area than somewhere else. So I want to make sure I'm not like accounting. So what we did in this case is we used data from two time periods, really. So one was that winter time period when they collect the abundant, they count the colony size at the beginning of the winter. That's the data I showed you. They also do another count late at the end of the late winter. And then we have the summer data that's spread across the Midwest in that time frame where we think the population size peaks. And we want to put that together. And then through that, we want to kind of model what's going on with the spring and what's going on with the autumn. So here's what we did. All right, I promise I won't go too mathy, but I got to do a little bit of it. So these are a map of where the locations are that our data come from in the Midwest. And I should mention that the reason we focus so much on the Midwest is there's been this other research on isotopes that show that the majority of monarch butterflies east of the Rocky Mountains that make it down to Mexico have come from this region. So it's not that the other areas aren't important, but we think this is the most important region, and there's the densest butterfly surveys here. So there's two different kinds of surveys. There's these statewide surveys, and you can see the year that they started, and that's again where people walk these same land transects, over at the same locations, and do that for years. And then there's the census surveys that I talked about with the North American Butterfly Association, where they're collecting these big radiuses of data, a lot of effort on a single day annually. And I'm sure you can see this, but right away, right, what sticks out? The locations of these are located like near where people are, right? So here's, the Chicago area, and look at the density of surveys, compared to other places in Wisconsin or Minnesota, or the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, right? So data are collected the way that volunteer science happens, data collection happens, is they're collected where people are, which makes sense. But we have to account for that. We don't want to just model where people are. We want to try and figure out what's going on across all spaces. So then what we did is here, first we talked about developing a sub-model for the summer. So this is a map of that Chicago area again. And what you can see is there's a really high density of surveys. And also what you can maybe see is that it really is, there's a lot of variation between the counties. So if we use like all this data, we want to use this data because it's useful. But if we count them all as like each their own data point, we're going to way overestimate the importance of what's going on in Chicago overall. So what we do is we model what's going on at the point relative to our mean count. So how many of the expected butterflies we think are in a county, and we include all those things that might affect what you see, like the survey type, how long they're spending surveying, all those sorts of things. And then we model the abundance at the county level. So then we're doing it separately for each county, according to those environmental variables that we think actually affect the biological process. So in this case, we wanted to do it related to our hypotheses. So we had the size of the late winter population size. Do we have an effect of that on the summer population? The weather in the spring, the weather, so that's like spring in Texas, right? So not those locations, but the weather as they were migrating up. The weather in the summer, what was it like at that specific location up until that point, the cumulative amount of Joe degree days, and the crops and herbicides. So how much crops are there in that county and how much herbicide has been sprayed in that county. So this is going to get us right at some of our hypotheses about why monarchs might be declining. And then, so that's the summer sub-model. So then we want to do kind of the same idea for the winter sub-model. So I think I mentioned, right, that they delineate, the size of the colony in winter, but they're actually a lot of different colonies. They're not all one colony. They're the peaks of these mountains. So what we wanted to do is model those colonies separately. So this is like the time series in each of those little tiny colonies, right? So some are bigger than others, and that's consistent, but we see variation in the sizes of those colonies through time and through space. So here's what we did for that. We want to model, okay, how much area is occupied by monarchs relative to what that size of that peak population was at the end of summer. How much nectar is available on that landscape as they go down that route in autumn, and also how much forest cover is available in that early winter at those locations. And that's fairly consistent because logging is illegal. However, sometimes we do see these illegal logging events that take place at these colonies, and we wanted to be able to account for that. And so, a colony could have left less than 1 year if it was, after a, some of these drops in some locations. I think one was here where we really see a decline because of some illegal logging. So we wanted to account for that too. And again, all these variables that we're including in both the summer and winter part of the model have been previously shown to be important. So our question is, how important are each of those? And what we needed to do then with that summer and winter model is link them together. So we do this thing where we estimate an average across all those counties. We can estimate, like, so here's the peak count across, and you can see there's variation in the size of the population across the Midwest. And then we take an index weighted by how much like habitat is available in each of those counties. So we get like a single kind of number with uncertainty in each year. So to get that peak winter or summer population size. And we link that together using that index. So we got this submodel components. And then again, our question, just to remind you, is the relative contribution of stressors along the migratory route. So what did we find? Well, what we found that was really interesting is very strong support. Now, again, remember, this is from 2004 onwards. So after that big increase of glyphosate application, but we found very strong support from 2004 onward for the climate change hypothesis. So spring and summer weather conditions were more than 7 times more important than other factors in explaining that variation year to year in sites. And what we did see the importance, of crops and herbicide, but 74% of that variation in that actual glyphosate application, so in that Roundup application, is attributed to the differences in counties and not years. So that annual change is less than a quarter of the variation, which means that, like, if you were a county that was spraying high, you were, here's this average, but if you were a higher county, you were always kind of spraying higher, year to year. So we don't see that huge variation in that application rates through time anymore. And then what we found is that the summer population was the strongest predictor of the total winter population size. So more than 90%, if we look at this relative importance, more than 90% of that variation in that early winter population size was due to the size of the summer population. And the nectar and the forest cover only had a tiny percent, of importance. Not that they're not important at all, but together, were much less important in determining the size of the population each early winter. And one of the reasons for this, I think, is really important is that when we here is a graph, right, of 1994 to the same time period, dash line in there, where we go back in time and we estimate those monarch counts and the peak summer monarch counts. And when we do that, we actually do find that decline. Remember when I showed you that graph that said, okay, the monarch population in the summer didn't look like it was declining, right? But that was only from one survey. That was from the North American Butterfly Association, right? And they only take it at one time of the year at different locations. And you saw there were a lot fewer of those than other data. So when we didn't integrate those data, we got a biased estimate of what was going on in the summer. And once we used all those data, we were able to say, yeah, the summer population is declining. It's just harder to detect, right? Because of the spatial location and timing of the monarch surveys of when volunteers go out. So we actually did find, okay, the summer population, when we include all available data, is actually declining. And then, okay, so let's dig into a little bit what we're seeing. So the monarch breeding range is getting warmer. So this is a graph that shows this growing degree day, right? So that's like cumulative variation. So these are deviations from that growing degree day. So if you're on a positive side, you're a lot hotter. If it was like a hotter summer at your location, and if you're negative, it's a lot cooler. And this is the amount of monarchs, okay? And so I'm showing this for sites that were a cool site, so something, in Minnesota, an average site, and a warm site, so something in, southern Ohio. And what we find is that the average and warm sites, the number of monarchs, does increase with temperature, right? But then it kind of starts to saturate out. So as you get hotter and hotter, you're not doing that much better, and you may be doing even a little bit worse at some of the warmer places. Whereas if you're a cool site, like you're in Minnesota and it's getting hotter, it's better for the monarchs, right? Because like a deviation here is, cooler than it would be for a deviation of warm site. And here's what we actually found. This is contrary to probably what you'll see about climate change predictions. So it's a little bit confusing. But if we looked at the region, what was the temperature increases from 1994, from this first decade up to 2003, and then compared to this last decade, we found that the cooler places actually got colder during that time frame, and the warmer places got warmer. And I want to say that this is like contrary to what we expect climate change will do in the future. These cooler places we expect to get warmer, but this is what actually happened between these decades. So that's, you know, the combo is bad for monarchs, right? These cooler places where it's better to be warmer were actually cooler, and the warmer places were actually warmer than average. So that's, you know, the wrong combination in this particular case. Okay, so it wasn't enough for us to just understand monarch trajectories. We really understand what can we do about this. So we want to figure out how can we mitigate this if the first declines. And so what we wanted to do is, all right, how about we project monarchs into the future? We developed this population model so we understand what are all those variables related to the population. And we wanted to look at climate projections, what the climate might do, what it might look like for monarchs in the future. So what we did with that, and there's all these different models, they're called global circulation models that predict the climate. You know, there's like 25 or 40 of them now, I think. And they all, you know, perform very differently in terms of what's going on. So what we wanted to do is predict into 3 time periods. So the near term, the mid-century, and the end of century to see how monarchs were doing. And we use different global climate circulation models. So we picked ones that met our criteria, which was like they actually had done well in the past at predicting those temperatures in the spring in eastern Texas and those temperatures of precipitation in the summer, right? We wanted to pick models. We did this criteria where we picked models that had performed well for the time frames and the locations that influence these monarch populations. And we did this under different emission scenarios, you know, if we do business as usual versus meeting the Paris Accords and different kinds of different emissions. And then we projected those weather variables into the future and used that for the climate. So here's what we found just about the climate. So these spots right here are this growing degree day, which is a metric of temperature and precipitation for those years that we have the data. So these black points here are the years of our 2004 to 2018 time period, what they were. And then these boxes are kind of the end of the century of where we think the variation would be under low, moderately high conditions. Okay, so this is in the spring. So what we were projecting, if you can kind of look, is that it's shifting this way, right? It's shifting, which means that it's getting hotter here and maybe a little bit variable. It's getting a little bit wider on precipitation, but not a huge change in precipitation. So this is in Texas. We think it is going to get hotter in Texas. According to these models, it shouldn't be that much different on precipitation. And so what we found is for the summer, that summers are getting warmer. So this is like at the end of the century, right? And this is under low and high emission scenarios. So 0 would be like, these are percent changes of warmer. So under high emission scenarios, not surprising, we see warmer, the locations are all getting warmer. And then what we also found is that we're going to see wetter summers in the east, and we see this under both high and low emission scenarios, wetter summers in the east, but not necessarily in the western range of the Midwest that might get cooler. So that's what we found. So then what we wanted to do is we wanted to use that to project monarch population size. So this is the same graph from before, you know, where we looked at the time frame. And what we did is we predicted the area occupied by monarchs under these different emission scenarios. And different time periods. And so this dashed line is the average over our 2004 to 2018 time period. And what we can see in the near future, even with these different scenarios, the average is about the same. But as we go further in time, right, under the high emissions, we're seeing that the size of the colonies is likely to go down. And one thing that we thought was really important is we wanted to look at the number of years that were forecasted to look before this historical minimum. So the smallest population size ever in 2013 was 0.67 hectares, which is really small. And what we estimate is even in the near term, under all the emission scenarios, that we're going to expect to see an average about 3 times, you know, in the next 20 years, for example, that the population would be likely to go under that size. Yeah, so not great news. And then what we wanted to do is this was like kind of an expected counts in these counties, but we wanted to look at where are the declines expected to be in the future in the Midwest. And so in the near time frame, we actually, this is really interesting, we expect to see increases in populations in some of these areas, like for example, in Northern Ohio and Indiana. And that's because, right, these are areas that are going to increase in precipitation and they're not getting, that much warmer. Whereas we're going to see through time that we're expected to see this like kind of higher areas, higher elevation and to the east are likely to decline in their amount of monarchs. And this is kind of under a low emission scenario in the future, like in the next 20 years. But I do want to point out that under high emission scenarios, by the mid-century, so in our kind of worst case scenario, we do expect to see, things declining. Maybe that there are some places that are better than others, but overall, we do expect to see those declines. So really what we wanted to think of is like, what are the conservation implications of this, right? So we've learned some of this, we forecasted, why do we do it? We did it to work with people to figure out like, okay, what's the best thing to do? And so our first is we think that, we've created these maps where you can look at where monarchs by county are expected to do better or worse. And so we think that, targeting restoration and conservation activities in areas where climate is projected to be favorable in the next, decades is a good idea. So we're working, we work with Fish and Wildlife Service and the states to figure out, okay, what's the best places that we want to do some of this milkweed restoration, that we want to do some of this pollinator restoration. And then the other thing, which we didn't talk too much about, but we want to figure out like, where are the gaps that we can collect data that will give us the most bang for our buck? If you kind of remember, there's not that much variation in the climate change scenarios in the next 20 years. So really our limitations in understanding what's going on is that we don't have the data in some locations. We have this data all around the cities, but if we could think of like specific areas where it would be really useful, like, I don't know, maybe the Grand Tetons, to collect more data, that would really help inform some of these areas where, we're limited in our understanding. Okay, so I just want to step back for a minute, the last couple of minutes of this talk, and talk about, well, what are our next steps, right? Because we zoomed in, we talked about the insect apocalypse, we talked about then the monarchs, and so thinking generally more back to the butterflies, what are we going to do about that, right? Because the monarchs is just one species. How are we going to zoom back out to think about all the other species? So one of the things that we're doing, like we talked about, is the Midwest has this really high density of data. So right now we're looking at doing kind of what we did for the monarchs across all the butterflies in the Midwest, where we're figuring out, all right, what are the contributions of the kinds of things related to climate and land use to the individual other butterflies, hundreds of butterflies in the area? And can we forecast what those drivers might look like into the future to figure out not what counties are just for monarchs, but what counties might be best for butterflies more generally to think about, restoring pollinator habitat, restoring some of those grasslands, prairies that used to be all over the Midwest. And so we're doing some of that specifically in the Midwest to go deeper into that. We're also kind of doing this large scale, slightly simplified version to examine drivers of butterfly declines across the US. So we're putting, into buckets. All right, how much in different locations has climate changed, has land use changed, and has pesticide use changed in different locations, right? Because, for example, butterflies in the high Sierras, there's really good data on the high Sierras from people who have been collecting for decades now. Butterflies there are declining, okay? But there's not a lot of pesticide use up there, right? So if we're thinking about what's going on in the high Sierras, it seems more likely that it would be something related to the climate. But at the same time, we know that the use of pesticides has really increased in places like the Midwest, and there's evidence that across butterfly species it might be one of the biggest drivers, right? So we know that there's going to be this spatial variation in one of these effects, and does it affect different species differently? So now we're trying to kind of figure out that across the United States. What are the drivers of that? And then if we step out back even more and think back to that bigger conservation questions, I think there's really these big opportunities to include many more and different types of data into research, right? I mean, really, if you take anything away from this whole talk, I hope you take away how important volunteer collected data are. It's just scientists cannot do it. We can't get to all the places that there are And that has been a massive, massive change, I think, in the field of ecology and conservation. And this is just like, this was data I downloaded from eBird. So probably a lot of you have heard that, which is a program where you can just, you know, do these checklists of birds that you see. And this was just one day, I think at 3 p.m. And there had already been 15,531 observations uploaded, right? So the amount, the volume is just fantastic. And so there's so many more different programs out there. And I think there's a real opportunity to integrate those data, put them together and do a lot more than has been possible in past generations. And along with that, right, like our computing power is also fantastic. And we have new models, AI, and ways that we can use these to get at our questions. And then another way kind of that we're thinking about, and I think other groups are thinking about, is can we develop these generalized modeling frameworks, right? We went so detailed into monarchs, and that took us years, like 15 years, right, of my life where we're dealing with how to do that. Can we develop these approaches to be more general across species? And that's something we're thinking about a lot. And, you know, the reason by this is like, if you look at this number of threatened species by country, right, it's just really, really huge. And so we want to, if we are going to have this kind of impact, you know, for insects and also other species, we need to be able to apply these kinds of approaches much more broadly and much more. So I just want to say thanks, especially, there's a lot of people who've worked on all the research that I presented, but especially to this team of researchers on the monarchs who have done a tremendous amount of work through time with every aspect of it. So it was a really great group to work with. And then also to thank our funders who have, you know, provided support for us to conduct this work, and the students and postdocs in the lab. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.